Because if God or if Baal wanted Gideon dead, then a God should be able to handle the task. And so they left Jerubbaal alone. And Gideon went on to do what you most know him for. He led an army of 32,000 men against an army of the Midianites of 135,000. And God reduced that number of 32,000 on Gideon's side down to 300. And from 300, Gideon defeated an army of 135,000. Why? Because God had chosen him. Israel goes on to live under peace for 40 years. Now comes our story. Abimelech is a son of Gideon. Not born to a wife, but born to a concubine, which is which Old Testament language for modern day mistress. So Gideon had many wives, and Gideon had 70 sons from those wives. But this concubine was not a wife, but yet gave him a son, Abimelech. Abimelech from Shechem, which is the capital of Israel. See, Israel would have 3 different capitals. You don't know of Shechem. You might not know that Samaria was once a capital, but you're very familiar with Jerusalem. But before Jerusalem, there was Shechem, then there was Samaria, and now we know as Jerusalem. So now we find that Abimelech realizes that with Gideon being dead, they need a king. They need a ruler. And what you have to understand is before kings were actually ushered in, Israel went through a period known as the Judges. Judges are what God used to handle the affairs of the people. Gideon is only the 5th judge of the first 5, but there were a total of 17 judges that ruled Israel for God. Stay with me. So as Abimelech realized the death of his father, and realized in the order of things, I have 70 brothers that have a right to the rule before I. Because although it says king, Gideon was not a king, he was only a judge, a military leader. But now, as Abimelech sees, he says, you know what? I can't wait for the voting or the results. So Abimelech took things into his own hand, and he went to Shechem, the capital at that time, to his mother's people, and they all converted and conversed each other, talked to each other about how they could handle it. And as you read, Abimelech asked the question, do you want 70 different rulers, or do you want me? And the people gave him money for him to go and hire some people to kill his brother. And they went and had a slaughter, put a hit out on 70 of those brothers. But 69 of them was killed during that attempt. The baby boy, Jotham, escaped because the Bible says, later on you read it, that he hid himself. And as he had hid himself, the simple fact of it is that then Abimelech became the ruler. Case in point. Jotham received the information, and he goes and decides to address the situation. But being careful, he addressed the situation as a parable. You do know the Bible has many parables. Jesus used the teaching of parable to demonstrate many of what he was talking about. Well, this is what you're reading when you read about the trees. Actually, the second parable in all of the Old Testament. For the Old Testament has a total of 11 parables. You read the second one, and the New Testament holds about 55 parables. What is a parable? It is God's way of using an earthly illustration to give a spiritual understanding or meaning. A parable is full of metaphors and allegories, whereby you draw the attention of your audience in by using familiar figures that they can relate to. And in this case, Jotham used the olive tree, the fig tree, the vine, which is a grapevine, and then later the bramble bush. I want you to know that our message this morning has to do with you having your thinking caps on to see just what we are in for in America and the world, not because of who was elected, but because of the atmosphere of the world and the United States right now. Simply put, he went to the olive tree. The olive tree said, why should I leave my service to God and man to serve over you? For an olive tree serves both as victuals, which is just a fancy word for, you remember the country word victuals? You ever heard victuals? Victual in the Bible and victuals are the same. It just simply means food fit for human consumption, which simply says that you can eat of the olive, or you can use the oil pressed from the olive. Then the olive tree said, why should I walk away from that use to worship or to serve you all as ruler? Then the other trees turned to the fig tree. The fig tree said, why in the world would I leave from the fact of me having the great juicy or sweet fruits of figs to worry about you all when I already have my purpose? Lastly, they go to the vine, which is the grapevine, the branches of vines that hold the great grapes that are also used as victuals, but also gives us a juice known as grape juice. Now know this, in Scripture, many times the grape juice can be unfermented, or it can mean wine, which simply means grape juice that is fermented. So when the Bible says, why should the vine says, why should I go unto you when I serve God and man? This is what it's referring to. Juice without fermentation is grape juice. Juice that is fermented, we call wine. Lastly, after these three eligible candidates, we have the bramble bush. The bramble bush is one described as a bush that has thorns. It will carry what we're more familiar with as raspberries, as its choice. But it was one of the bushes least desired. But it was the only bush that said, I'll do it, but if you elect me, just know you will have to abide under my shadows, or else I will have fire come from me and devour you as the cedars of Lebanon. Last point, the cedars of Lebanon speaks to the strength and majesty of the Lebanon tree. The cedars of Lebanon is so distinctive that it is what Solomon and David brought from Lebanon to build the first temple. So the symbolic nature of the cedar, which means that with the majesty, the strength, and the notoriety of the Lebanon tree, if you elect me, the bramble bush says, just know that there will be consequences. But they went ahead and said, we want you, bramble bush. Case in point, be careful what you ask for. Because we have had choices in America. Call it olive tree, or call it another candidate. Call it the fig tree, or call it another party. Call it the grapevine, or call it another movement. Call it the bramble bush, or call it the elected president. Just know that God has a way of allowing us to get what we want. Because sometimes, giving a person what they want, they have to find out if it's really what they need. We already know that some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered prayers. Now, that sounds wrong on the onset. An unanswered prayer is a gift. Well, you ask somebody that was praying for that person who they just had to have 20 years ago. And they see that person 20 years later, and they thank God that God did not give them that person who they just had to have. Amen, somebody? You ask that person about that job that you just believed, that person who believed they just had to have that promotion. They didn't realize what that promotion encountered. But it was only after 15 years of seeing the person that got the job and all that they went through that they go back and thank God that you didn't give me that job. You ask the person